Welcome back to the Pushing Through Loss podcast, where we share stories, honor resilience, and embrace strength. I am Kalila Green Siciliano, and it is my honor to begin the journey with you. I'm here with Suzanne, who I actually recently met through a course that we were both in. And her story, from what I've learned so far, is really one that I'm honored to have you share. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you for being willing to just share your heart and share your grief.
Oh, thank you so much for having me as your guest. I really am privileged.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's back up a tiny bit, because we've already started talking before we recorded, and I've learned a little bit about your story. And I understand that you had a son at 9 years old who passed away from cancer.
From leukemia. Yes.
Wow. So what was that like, first leading up to having a totally healthy kid and then learning about that diagnosis?
So Christopher, so he first got sick when he was 3.
Okay.
And so he was leukemia totally out of the blue, not, he wasn't a sickly child, nothing. Woke up one morning, had a cough, was sluggish, and took him to the pediatrician because we were going out of town for a wedding. They said, oh, we can hear something in his lungs. Here's albuterol, do breathing treatments. And his cough got progressively worse over the weekend. And I'm thinking, my mind usually went to worst case scenario, but my worst case scenario was pneumonia. Right. That's the worst. Or maybe my sister said he might be having an asthmatic attack,
Right.
But it was never leukemia,
Right.
Never cancer. And 5 days after he woke up with that cough, we were told he had childhood leukemia.
Wow. That must have been such a blow to be like, of course, when your mind goes to the worst case scenario, you're not thinking cancer ever, but there it was staring you in the face.
So what happened that weekend, it kept getting worse. And my sister's like, it looks like he's having an asthmatic attack. Why don't you take him to the local ER? And we were in this itty bitty town. So we went, and they told us, they did x-rays. They're like, oh, your son has a collapsed lung. We're like, what? Like,
wow.
That is even like, how could he go from a cough to a collapsed lung?
Right.
So then we couldn't stay at that hospital because they didn't know how to do the procedure to drain his lung.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to go to a hospital in Buffalo.
Okay.
And then in Buffalo, they did tons and tons more tests. And they call us in the next morning, and we're getting ready to go home. Like, we're ready to go pick up our other son who's still at the wedding that we left. And they're like, we think your child might have a malignancy.
Wow.
And we're like,
right. You're not even with your own doctors. You're not in your own area. You're totally in a foreign place. I mean, not so foreign because it's not that far from your house, but it's not
6
your
hours
comfort.
or 7 hours. We didn't know I have any doctors. Nobody, no family was even there because they were all at the wedding, which was an hour and a half away.
Wow.
And we were just like, and the doctors said to us, this is the easiest, this is the good kind of cancer. So he has an 80% chance of beating this. You'll invite us to his graduation, his wedding, but we're hearing cancer. Like, we couldn't take anything. I mean, it was very kind of the doctor to try to help us, but we were like, cancer? Like, so, when we were at the hospital before that with the collapsed lung, we were trying to figure out ways to get home because we didn't want to be somewhere else. And they said, oh yeah, you can drive home. But then as we talked, you couldn't drive home. And you couldn't, I said, could we get a medevac? No, he's not serious enough. Well, then once we were talking about much worse things, they're like, you have to be medevaced home. You can't drive home.
So were you allowed to then be in the helicopter with him?
Oh my gosh. So yes, but, so my husband drove home because he knew I would have crashed. There was no way I would have been able to drive home because I was crying so much that I wouldn't have been able to see through my tears.
Right.
So we waited for the medevac. It took forever. Of course, I didn't understand how hospitals work. Nothing is fast, right?
No.
And so they come and they're like, okay, we're ready to take your son. And the lead doctor comes in and says, oh, you can't come. And I'm like, excuse me?
You're like, my child is 3 years old. What do you mean I can't come?
And she said, oh, don't worry about it. We'll be there. I'm like, you're a stranger.
Right.
My little boy is so scared and I am not leaving him.
Right.
And you better find room for me. And, I am not like a confrontational person, but I was mama bear all the way.
Yeah.
Right. And it became a non-issue because they couldn't find a helicopter. They needed to use a Learjet. So then there was room. Yeah.
So in a way, it was sort of like, I very strongly believe in God, and it was like God maneuvering things around to be like, no, you're going to be there. It's okay.
Yes, there is no way. I mean, if that was the case, I probably would. Oh, I can't even tell you. I mean, I know this is not even where we were meant to go, but this was like wild. So I get on the plane and we fly into New Jersey, and ambulance comes at the airport to pick us up. And the ambulance, this doctor, remember, I'm totally hating this doctor, right? This lead doctor who wanted me to kick me off the plane, right? Didn't want me on the plane. An ambulance crew comes up and says, okay, you can turn him over to me. We have 2 people. There was a staff of 4 on the plane with us, 2 people picking us up. And they're like, just give him to us. We'll take him. And this lead doctor's like, no, we have a staff of 4. We're a doctor, nurse, and 2 paramedics. We have to have the same level of care to turn them over. Wow. And so all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I think I'm liking you a little better now.
Right. You're starting to join the good graces here.
And then my like of her went up 100-fold because we're in the ambulance and they're saying, okay, we're on the way to X hospital. I'm not saying the hospital names on purpose, right? And because I'm writing a memoir and I actually changed the names of the hospitals because we always have to do that, right?
Right.
So they're like, we're on the way to X hospital. And I'm like, that's the wrong hospital. We were in the wrong ambulance. If they had taken my child on the medevac without me, he would have ended up at the wrong hospital. My very sick child would have been lost.
Oh my goodness.
Our ambulance was on the other side of the airport.
That's crazy.
So I was the only one who knew my hospital.
Right.
We get to the hospital and because my boys were born there, so I'm directing this very large staff of now 6 people.
Right. Where to go.
Where to go.
Wow.
I have to say that all of that craziness was a little bit of a blessing in disguise, if you can use that word, because it was a distraction, right? We were in a very, very scary place. Right. And all of that craziness made me forget a little bit, right? Because I had to be focused on figuring out like where
logistics,
to go.
Right.
Exactly. And then of course, when we got to the hospital, my husband showed up a little bit later, and draining the lung was super easy. That first hospital was like, we could puncture his heart or puncture his lung. I didn't tell you that part, the very first hospital. They're like, it's super easy. Don't worry about it. That is not an issue. And then I didn't tell you this part either, because they said to us, those doctors in upstate New York said to us, very small chance it could be an infection. Like it could be cancer and it might be an infection. So I'm trying to hang on to infection, right? But in my mind, I know it's not likely. Right. And then when he came out of surgery, because they had to go in and do a bone marrow tap. And they also, if it was positive, then they were going to put a catheter in his chest. And so when we saw like the IV was no longer in his hand and it was in his chest, we knew without them telling us, and it was just awful. Like that first month was just, I was so angry at God. I was, my little boy, like, taking him. So we went to clinic one day. The treatment was outpatient. And then after he was in the hospital for a week and then he was discharged. Treatment was for 1 week, with outpatient. And I'm going out the door. My husband's already had to go back to work. So I'm going to the clinic by myself. I have a sitter for my baby. This was like a nutshell of my life. And that's why I'm sharing it. So my 1-year-old is screaming because he could talk early. Mommy, take me, take me. Aww. And my 3-year-old is screaming, I don't want to take me back there. They hurt me. Aww. And that was like when people say, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. I'm like, yeah, sorry. No, not true.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can't handle this.
Yeah, I can't handle this. So, but I have to tell you like something good that came. So like he got into remission after 28 days.
Wow.
So with childhood leukemia, that's how fast remission can be, 28 days. So then treatment is long. It was 2.5 years of treatment. He was low risk, so the treatment wasn't as hard. And once he got into remission, I'm like, now granted, that didn't mean my worry was out of, like, I worried, I was a worrier, but it did mean, okay, like he's in remission, cancer's in our rear view mirror. Treatment, we still had ups and downs with treatment. I still worried about germs because I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder when my kids were babies, meaning I worried about everything, so I worried about what the treatment would do to him. He was a little guy, but for the most part, like I'm generally a positive person. So I used a lot of tools to help balance me.
Those tools are so key because I feel like even with pregnancy loss, when I went through it, I've always felt like I've been a very resilient person, but that tested me in ways that I had no idea was even possible. And without the tools that I learned, without the tools that my therapist gave me, without the tools that I had gotten from research and things like that, I would not be where I am now. And I feel like those are the things that we need to be teaching other kids, other people to talk about, because we all have this. We all have something, and it's awful. And how do you get through it?
It's so true. I was in therapy. I'd been in therapy from when, probably since my younger son was a baby and Christopher was 2. It was interesting though. The tools I came up with just came to me from, this isn't working. How can I find a way to get it work? And no one gave it to me. So, one of the ones was, so when you have a catheter in your chest, if you get a fever of 101 or higher Fahrenheit, I was speaking to someone yesterday who was in England, so I had to say Fahrenheit.
They're like, that's very high.
Exactly. You have to go to the hospital because they have to make sure it's not something really serious. So we didn't know from day to day, if he gets a fever, we might have to go to the hospital. And so that was one reason. And the second reason is treatment was very long. Treatment was 2.5 years. So Christopher would be on treatment until he was 5.5. Ryan would be, my younger son would be 3.5. And so therefore I was like, they are never going to be these young ages again. So I don't want to miss out. So, and I wanted to make sure we did fun. Fun had to be, these were little boys. They weren't focusing on cancer. They were focusing on play. The doctor said to us on day 1, your children will get you through this. Their primary purpose is play. So while you're out there worrying about everything, all they want to do is play. That's how they learn. That's how they grow. So I started one fun thing a day, no matter what.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And it would be, if it was raining, we built an obstacle course in our living room.
I love that.
So, and adults can do that. We as adults should do one fun thing a day because we get so absorbed in our to-do lists and our day-to-day stuff. And, an adult, one fun thing a day can be sitting down and reading like a delicious chapter in a book. It doesn't have to be throwing a tennis ball into a spaghetti pot, but you could, that could be fun. Right?
Totally. It's so funny that you said that, because with COVID, I actually started a website that's called Our Online Village, because I felt like everything had gone away, but we still need a village. We still need to have those people around us. And I did the exact same thing where every single day I posted a different exercise for everybody to do with their families, because how much fun could you possibly have in the same spot all the time? And so it's true. Finding the joy in the little things is really what's key.
It really is. And what a great idea to do that.
Thank you.
The other thing that saved me, and this came from another mom whose child was fighting leukemia at clinic. She said, Suzanne, there's going to be things that in this 2.5 year period that are going to be so great. But if we don't write them down, we're going to forget them. So she started a gratitude journal. And I thought, I'm doing one too. So I started a gratitude journal, and a mom at clinic, I was talking to another mom at clinic, and I had told her I was starting a gratitude journal. And she's like, you're grateful this is happening to us? And I said, what? no, no, but I want to focus on what's good. And
Right.
this is the thing about gratitude journals that people who don't use one don't realize,
Mhm.
is that when you keep a gratitude journal, your mind automatically starts putting more weight to the positive
Mhm.
and less to the negative. So
Yes.
now I'm a yoga instructor. I teach yoga for stress management to high school and college students,
Mhm.
and at a local community college. And I give them my assignments. The assignments they get are the ones that helped me. So
Right.
they do a gratitude journal, they do a mindfulness, like savoring assignment.
Mhm.
They have to do a random act of kindness. They have
I
to
love
meditate.
those.
Yeah.
One of the things I also found helpful for me that ironically my best friend's daughter had introduced to me well before I had gone through a miscarriage or anything. And I always credit her because my best friend, her first of all, her kids are phenomenal, as is my best friend, but they're just so insightful. And this is where I carried this with me for years. And I do this with my kids, and I did it as part of a gratitude thing. And maybe you can even teach your students, but you get a grid. So even just one piece of graph paper, and every single box is a different day of the year. And you assign your emotion a different color. So happiness, I like to say, is yellow, and anger is red, and depression is black, and gratefulness is green, things like that. And every single day at the end of the day, you color in that box of that day with the overwhelming emotion you felt. And at the end of the year, you have this beautiful tapestry of all these different colorful emotions. And you can go back and remember and say, oh, that's right. On that day, I was feeling this emotion, but the next day I was really off, or I felt much better, or whatever it is.
Wow, that's beautiful.
I
That's
love
very
that
cool. I
exercise.
would have to do it over 3 months because we're on semesters, but
That works.
or 6 months.
Right. Right. But it's a really interesting way to separate the days without having to write down a whole bunch of stuff, without having to remember like, oh, what actually happened today? It's more of how do I feel right now?
Mm. I would probably do it in addition to, because I find that keeping those, like, and I say to them, you can just write one word, right?
Hmm.
It just can be a bullet list, because the actual act of writing down the positive
Hmm.
thing um, shifts your day.
Right.
So like you'll be walking around and you'll see a flower and you'll feel like this immense gratitude.
Yes.
Whereas without keeping it, you don't even acknowledge the
Right.
flower.
Right. I agree with you 100%.
So yes. So my son Christopher, so he got into remission in when was it? He got sick in 2001. So he was probably done with treatment. Yes, in January of 2004.
Okay.
And so, and the last year and a half, last 2 years of
Hmm.
treatment were much easier. Mostly daily chemo pills, um, some spinal taps and bone marrow taps, but 3 months apart.
Right. So
So I say
he
that,
felt like much more of a normal kid at that point.
yeah, like he always felt normal. He
Right.
always felt normal. And
Thank God for kids' resiliency.
yes. And he lost his hair, but it came back fast.
Right.
And he didn't lose all of it just because he was low risk. So he was back in school. He started pre-K 6 months late. And then he
Wow.
was in school the rest of the time. He was in school his whole life, right?
Wow.
Um, and he played sports and we went skiing and we did everything.
That's amazing.
I had to give a letter, a chickenpox letter. So chickenpox is deadly to a child on chemo.
Mhm.
And so I would have to, any activity he did, I would have to give it out to parents and say, if your child gets chickenpox, you have to let me know within 72 hours. The window
Mhm.
is 96. So then in 2006, so that was like about 2 years later,
Mhm.
um, you know, cancers are way behind, like
Right.
we'd
He's
already,
already done with chemo treatments and
he's
all that kind of
done, like
stuff.
he was done with remission, So at
Right.
4.5 years of remission, he started getting fevers.
Oof.
And I am not thinking cancer,
Right.
because every single time he got a fever, which wasn't much previously, they were like, this is normal. This is strep throat. This is a
Right.
normal childhood illness.
Right.
So he gets a really high fever, 105 for
Wow.
7 days, but it's only day 2 now, right?
Mhm.
So they send us to the pediatrician. They say, get blood work, get a chest x-ray. I'm like, that's weird, but whatever. I'm not thinking anything of it. He did have pneumonia like years after. So wasn't anything major, pneumonia compared to leukemia is a walk in the park.
Right.
And I don't mean to minimize that for people who have a really serious case of pneumonia, but
No, when you've gone through the cancer, you look at anything else and you're like, we can handle that.
Exactly. So, so they call us back with the results. And so the pediatrician who is not, so Christopher's pediatrician also happened to be his oncologist. He was actually a hematologist. So a different pediatrician calls us back and the oncologist is in the room with him. And I'm like, what? Like, why are you in the room?
Right.
So they start throwing out words that you would only know if you had a severely suppressed immune system, most likely due to having had cancer. And I'm like freaking out. And I'm like, is it back? I can't even use the words. And they said, no, the blast cells don't show anything. Oh, thank God. But if his immune system isn't up in 2 days, we'll do a bone marrow tap. There is no reason to do a bone marrow tap unless you are looking for cancer, a serious disease. Right. I don't know. There are other things you can look for. It may not be cancer, but it would be something really serious, right? So his immune system.
Do they have to put them under for a bone marrow tap?
They do. They do.
So that's why, and they don't really want to resort to that.
Actually, they don't. They don't have to put you under for a bone marrow tap. You can use local. We have done that. We have done it that. Wait, let me think. I'm confusing spinal tap and bone marrow tap. Spinal tap you can do with local. Bone marrow tap you go under. Yes, because it's super, super painful. But they don't want to do it anyway because bone marrow tap is very painful. They don't ever want to inflict pain on anyone, especially a child. So they did not do it. And he kept getting fevers every month, but they're like normal childhood illness, lots of stuff going around. Around Easter of that year, has another fever. And I'm like, shoot. Like all this time, I'm like once he put it in my head, it was hard to take it away, even though I did not want it. Everyone was like, Suzanne, you are over worrying. Because remember, I didn't tell you this, but every I was worst case scenario, like every chest pain is a heart attack, every headache is a brain tumor. Like I had generalized anxiety disorder. So everybody's
and you've already been through you've gotten the cancer diagnosis. So it's not like it's out of the realm of conceivability to then say, well, this is the worst case.
But my husband was trusting the doctors because the doctors were saying, this isn't it. He's like, why would you go there if you don't have to go there? And that's what a person who doesn't have extreme anxiety would think. Like, why would you go there? There's no reason to do that, right? So they do a bone marrow tap to rule out leukemia. They sit me down, they call me down to a back room already. You do not, if you're in the same location, if you get moved to a new location, it's bad news. Because otherwise they just tell you good news. Check 3 times, it's back. I'm like, so second time, so much worse. Because you know what's to come. And it's so much harder to treat the second time. But he gets into remission after 28 days. Again.
Wow.
Huge. So great. Harder treatment this time. The first time he never went in hospital again. So like 1 week in hospital, all clinic treatment. He had a very relatively easy, but this time it's much harder. We have to go to the hospital more. We have to, we have more, it's all inpatient treatment, but we still make the best of it because I've learned how to fight so hard to give my children a normal life. And that fighting spirit, was huge because, and this time around, it's all about making their life normal. So before it was one fun thing a day, but now my children are in school. My older child's in 2nd grade and my younger son's in kindergarten. So I want to do whatever makes life normal. I want them to have normal. Spending one fun thing a day playing with mom doesn't cut it anymore.
Unfortunately, they grow out of that.
It's be with their friends. So, we did what we could, it was kind of funny because, it's crazy how your mind goes. So, it was Memorial Day weekend, and he was supposed to go in for treatment. And my boys always go to the pool opening, the town pool on Memorial Day weekend.
Right.
My son is bargaining with me. I'll go for longer days. Just don't make me go. And, treatment is like, you do treatment unless you're very sick and you can't do it, but you do not miss treatment unless you're sick. So we go in, and he listens to his lungs, and she's like, he has bronchitis. We can't do treatment. And
he's like, wait, I can go to the pool.
We're like dancing. And the old me, first time around, I would have been like, what does this mean for treatment? But I know delays happen. Right. If your counts are too low, they can't do treatment because that's against protocol.
Right.
So, we're super thrilled that we can go on Tuesday instead of we get to go to the pool.
Right. I love that. I love that you find the joy in like the tiny little things that somebody else would be like, what? You're celebrating the fact that he has bronchitis? And you're like, but now he gets to go to the pool and have fun.
Exactly. The one question I asked, can he still swim? And they said, oh yeah, he can do anything as long as he's up for it.
That's awesome.
So he did great on treatment. They gave him a chemo. It was really hard, but we rose up because that's just what we do as a family, like we would just do whatever we had to. But there was one chemo they gave to him, and they said this could cause a secondary cancer 10 to 15 years down the road. And I said, no, we're not signing off on this. Absolutely not. And they said, you don't sign off on this, he won't beat this cancer.
Wow.
You have to give it to him. So 1 year out from when he got sick in April, about a year later, he got sick, normal child, virus going around school, just a virus in school. But it took him really long for his counts to bounce back. And everyone's like, that happens after a virus. Don't worry about it. Because this is what they see. That's what's normal, right? His counts just weren't bouncing back. And in my mind is, let's not wait too long. Right. If God forbid it is a relapse, let's get a hold of it. So I didn't know you couldn't have just a little bit of cancer. You either have it or you don't. Right. They do the bone marrow tap. It's a worse kind of cancer. It's no longer childhood leukemia, it's adult leukemia. Wow. And you have to have a bone marrow transplant. So that time around, there was no positive spin. There was no, we transferred him to a cancer hospital in New York City. There was I was just devastated. It was really hard to be positive for our kids. But I discovered this book. Someone from my church gave me this book, and it was like prayers for impossible cases. Oh, interesting. And that became my Bible, and I studied it, and I believed God would save him. And it shifted me. And one time, but the thing was, he did not get into remission after 28 days. It's a different way. It's more like treatment it's just higher treatment. And at any rate, he didn't each time he wasn't getting in, and I was at the hospital. I was going to church one morning, and I was like, you know what, you have a choice. Treatment is 2 weeks. You can, I wasn't, I was distracted. My kids would tell me something. I wasn't listening. I was snapping at my husband. I was so lost. Right. And then I'm like, you have a decision. You won't know for 2 weeks. So you can either decide it's worked, or you can stay where you're at. And I'm like, I'm deciding it's worked. I'm going to believe it worked. Because, and so I used things like that. And I believed God would save him. And so I was able to be present with my children. People thought I was very naive. The doctor called me over. I was fooling around with the boys in the hallway one day. And he's like, he pulled me aside. If we do not get him into remission, he's going to die. And I'm like, what do you expect me to do? Walk around long-faced? Right. It's one of those mixed blessings where even though, like you said, you're diagnosed with extreme anxiety, your brain still has a way of functioning to say, either I am going to sit here and wallow
And what good is that going to do for anybody? Or I'm going to enjoy the time I have. And that way, at least I know I have good memories and I know I have happy times with whatever I have.
Yes. And in my case, I truly believed he would live. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
truly believed that. I had heard of other worst case scenarios, my friend's child, so I believed it. I should tell you, I did go on anti-anxiety medication when Christopher was 3, and
Mm-hmm.
I was still on it, and they kept upping the dose
Mm-hmm.
because that made me like more normal anxiety
Mm-hmm.
versus otherwise I wouldn't have been as good a mom. And that's
Mm-hmm.
important for people to know. Like, if you are where I was at, take the medication. Like,
Right.
I am an alternative. I do alternative work now to help people heal and or release discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you need medicine.
Yes. Yeah. And thank God it's there for a reason. Like you said, if you need it, take it. It's okay. It's not a failure. It's helping you to get to where you need to be.
Exactly. I would not have been as good a mom because I could, like, when we were on the playground, if I didn't see them, I heard them and I knew they were okay. Before that, if I did not see them or
You would
hear
start to
them,
panic.
exactly.
Right.
But sadly, he never got into remission, and he passed in July of 2007.
Got it. I'm so
And
sorry.
thank you. And I was destroyed, not
Yeah.
devastated, destroyed. We were
Yeah.
destroyed. I lost my faith in God.
Right.
I was so angry with him. My husband wasn't angry at God because he did not have the same, he knew Christopher was going to die,
Mm-hmm.
or he believed it, but
Mm-hmm.
thankfully he was, I said, years later, I said, thank you. Like, you knew. And he's like, but you didn't. And I wasn't going to take that away from you.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, I'm glad I didn't know because I could be so present and joyful. And my kids read me like a book. Like,
Right.
my little boy, after Christopher passed, I took him to meet his cousin at my parents' house to swim. Like, 5 days later, it was horrible and it was so difficult, but I had to show my younger son that he was equally important.
Yeah.
And he asked if he could go for a sleepover at his cousin's house because they always did that. And I went,
Mm-hmm.
like, my sister had asked me before, can Ryan come for a sleepover? And I'm like, no,
Right. I
no,
don't
no,
want to
no,
let him out of my
no,
sight.
no. I lost one child. No.
Right.
And then Ryan, so happy, can I have a sleepover? And I was like, I paused. And then he's like, yes, you can go. And he looks at my eyes and he's like, I don't believe you. Your eyes don't tell me that. And he said, no, like, you can go. And he's like, no, mom, if it's going to make you too sad, I won't go. And
Oh
I
my
went,
gosh, that's going to make me cry.
and I said, no, we'll be fine. And of course I lied, but
But the
that's what
fact that
moms
he
do.
could read it in your eyes and knew, and then second, like almost had that moment of, okay, I don't want to go, but then ended up going and still continuing life. That's the whole point of all of this, that his life is equally as important and he's still here.
Yes, yes. He was our saving grace because I was in deep grief for 3 years.
Right.
3 years. Like, I talked about wanting to die. My
Mm,
poor little boy. I mean, people were like, did you hold it together and then, not fall apart in front of your child? And I'm like, no, in the beginning, no.
right.
I had no control.
Right.
I I couldn't, he was parenting me, which sounds so sad because he was only 7,
Mm,
but like, I was crying hysterically. I was reading something someone gave me. It was early morning. He and I were still sleeping in his brother's bed because
mm.
to be close to Christopher. And he comes downstairs and he's like, what are you reading, mommy? And I'm like, oh, there's something somebody gave me. And he pulls it out of my hand and he puts it in the drawer. That's not good for you. Don't read that.
Aw, he sounds so wise for being so little.
Both of my boys were so wise. Like,
Yeah.
so I think God gave me very wise children because of what we needed to do. Right.
Right. It's
But
interesting. My daughter does the same thing where, especially for the first full year after I had lost the baby, where very often if I would get upset, she would immediately come over and give me a hug and ask me if everything was okay. And was I normal upset or was I baby upset? And it just broke my
mm,
heart because I felt like she deserves to not have that in her head. But at the same time, it made me so proud to think that she's so empathetic and can so understand other people's emotions that she's able to connect with me on that.
Yes. Yes. That's so huge. And children really can read. And that's why
Yeah.
I'm glad that I believe so strongly, because my children would be able to see it in me, because yeah. But children are incredible, right?
Yeah, they really are.
I slowly, I had a lot of tools. I saw a grief counselor for 3 years,
Okay.
and that helped me. She was amazing. I stopped seeing my regular therapist. I became very adamant. I didn't want anybody telling me what to do who hadn't lost a child.
Mm-hmm.
And while my grief therapist hadn't, she had counseled many, many, many moms who had.
Mm-hmm.
So that was helpful. But there were a lot of things that, I had so many tools. Like, we went back to tools before. They were different tools, but they helped me,
Right.
And I finally did. I have to say, I was so angry at God, and I had no relationship with God. But I discovered I would not survive if I didn't have a relationship with God,
Mm-hmm.
because and I couldn't pray. I no longer had words because I was so distraught. So I started doing Bible studies and reading scripture, because I needed to read his words because my words were empty.
Mm-hmm.
And that was slowly, and I remember saying to my sister, like, you can pray if you want to. You don't have to pray, because your life still goes on. If I don't get up and read the Bible every day and do a Bible study, I will be in a black hole and I will not be able to function.
Mm-hmm. And I think that
So
that's really powerful to understand what you needed in that moment. And everybody's different. Like you said, you needed that. I was also in a place afterwards in Judaism. There's very prescribed ways of doing things in everyday life, in waking up in the morning and before you eat and after you eat and going to the bathroom even. I mean, everything. And yet the only place I found that there was not a very prescribed way of doing something was after a miscarriage. And I, for the first few days, felt very lost. And so looking into more deeply what I could connect with made it more tangible and made it something that felt more real. And I think same thing for you in terms of understanding that your own words didn't have anything in them, but yet you could look to the Bible, you could look into your faith, and you can say, this is what I need to connect with right now. It just makes it so much more powerful.
it does. And it took me a good month and a half to get there,
Mm-hmm.
because I was asking all other moms who lost a child. Some were miscarriages, some were, more similar situations to me, not necessarily cancer, but a child that was alive and living with them for many years. And then Elizabeth Edwards, her husband John Edwards, ran for president, you might recall. She was doing a book signing at the bookstore a mile from my house, and I'm like, Mom, we have to go listen to her, because she lost her 16-year-old son Wade to a car accident.
Wow.
And so I raised my hand and I'm like, how did you find the will to live again? Because I had no will to live.
Right.
And she told me about an online grief group that I joined.
Mm-hmm.
And, this was pre-Facebook, pre-video calls,
Right.
of course. And that helped a lot. And yoga helped, and meditation helped, and, my running helped, and family helped. And there was a lot, right? And then I learned a unique practice that I now teach others called Jin Shin Jitsu, which literally helps with grief and stress and physical discomfort in the body.
Mm-hmm. It's so beautiful that you can connect with that, because like you said, from going to having no will to live to being able to now teach others how to work through grief and how to heal and how to continue living your life is so important.
It's so important, and there's been things I've done along the way. Like, so I've been teaching yoga for 13 years, and I was part of an organization called Kula for Karma, and they work in hospitals, they work in prisons, they work with at-risk groups. It doesn't have to be at risk, but it can also be just all different groups. They give yoga teachers, yoga teachers donate their time. And so an email came through, is there a yoga instructor who wants to teach kids fighting cancer? I'm like, delete.
Not ready for that.
And because I had this like terrible shame that I never told anyone, including my husband, that I can say it now because I finally said it. I wrote about it in my book, is I was jealous of kids fighting cancer because they were alive.
Right.
And it made me feel so disgusted inside because who would ever be envious of children fighting cancer? Like that's like a horrible, crazy person, right? That's what my mind was
that's where
telling me.
you were at.
Yes, because my son wasn't alive, right? I wanted him still fighting cancer.
Right.
So the email came through a month later, no teacher found. And I heard this voice that wasn't mine that said, say yes. Aww. This isn't just about the kids.
Right.
So I went in and I taught yoga to kids fighting cancer. And, I was the perfect teacher because my son played tag in the hospital on an IV pole. It didn't faze me. These kids were hooked up to IVs and we did yoga. The IV line's long enough. Right. And, and the parents were like, can he do that? And I'm like, yes.
As long as he's up for it. Yeah.
Yes. And kids are almost always up for it, unless they're some kids I would do meditations, like fun meditations. We'd go to their favorite place in their mind, And, but that I did it for, I don't remember, maybe I started in the spring. And then that Thanksgiving, I wrote thank you letters to every single person in my family. We have like 19 of us. And I thanked them for being in my life. And I thanked them for their gifts that they gave me. And I have to tell you, I was very angry with most of my family after Christopher died. Not all, but a lot of them wanted me to get through grief faster. You might have experienced that.
Yep.
And they would tell me how to grieve. And I was like, you don't know. Right. So here, 6 months later, I am thanking them for being in my life and for all that they gave me and their unique gifts. Teaching, which I didn't realize, I got to see that those kids were Christopher and those moms were me.
Right.
And it was huge healing.
Right. And I think for you to be able to share that it did make you angry and it did make you jealous, that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for this podcast, because it's all normal and it's all okay. And wherever your mind goes in that moment, you're in grief and you are not thinking sanely. You're not thinking normally. You're not, and that is all part of the process. There is no normal when it comes to grief. And one of the things that I think really affected me the most was learning about the phases of grief as opposed to the stages of grief, because it makes it a big difference in your head when you can say it's a phase. It will happen and you could go back to it. Phases are fluid. Phases are something that you enter and you exit and you go back into, and it's not like it's complete once you've experienced that. Whereas other people who hear, well, it should be a stage and then you're done with it, you've now learned how to get past that, then why aren't you finished with it? And so to hear the normal aspects of all of those crazy thoughts, you're not alone. You're not the only one that's thinking those things.
It's so true. It's so true what you say about phases versus stages too. And you know what my grief counselor said that was helpful to me as well, especially when you get further along in your journey in grief, not in the beginning, is she calls it shadow grief. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't, but I feel like I can understand the term.
Yeah. So some days your shadow is really big. Like if you look at your shadow on the sidewalk, some days it's really large, right? And that's how your grief is. And some days you can't even see it, but it's still there.
Right.
You just don't see it. And I actually posted something on IG a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving. And I said, and I don't really talk about grief much anymore, but because I'm 16 years out. And this is why I posted something, because I said, grief grabbed me by like the shirt the other day. It came out of the blue. I felt so flat. Nothing interested me. My meditations, my visualizations, they weren't helping like they usually do. And then I'm like, oh, this is grief.
Yeah.
And it got a lot of feedback because a lot of people were like, oh, thank you for putting that into words for me.
Right. Because it does come out of nowhere. And I spoke to somebody who I met through the podcasting class, who lost her child at 6, and also from cancer. And she says the same thing. Like she's 16 years removed. And so she feels that most days it's okay. Most days she can live life normally and live life to the fullest, but yet sometimes there's that moment that just knocks you off your feet. And you have to give yourself grace. This is, unfortunately, it's the new normal, and this is where you are at the moment, but that's okay. And I think that's what bothers me about the fact that nobody talks about this, because it is okay. It's all okay. Your feelings are totally valid, whether you're a year out or 16 years out or 50 years out.
Yes. Yes. And a lot of people, your feelings are so valid. And that's not to say that you won't have joy.
Right.
Because that's why my podcast is called Finding Joy in the Hard.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do have joy. I mean, I've talked to other moms who've lost their child and they don't have joy post-death, but I do. You know, I do. I think in part it might be because I fought so hard to save my son's life. I fought so hard to give them a normal life. I fought so hard to bring joy and normalcy and laughter and fun in. But, you know, but like you said, the feelings run the gamut. So if you have joy, sometimes guilt will show up.
Right.
And, you know, no, like your person that you lost, they want you to be happy. They don't want you to be sad.
Right.
You know, and they are okay. My son came to me in a dream multiple times to tell me he was okay.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's true. You have to continue living, because if you don't, that's it. That you have one life. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, I started a foundation in my son's name, and we don't do anything with cancer. He loved to create comics and sell them on the front lawn. So isn't that so sweet? So my 6 friends of mine and we got around a kitchen table, you know, we incorporated ourselves, we got our nonprofit status, and we bring professionals in from New York City to teach the kids how to create their own original comic strip. And we were very definite that we go to underserved communities because my kids had a lot of hope and opportunities. Despite my son having leukemia 3 times, we had hope. And some kids don't have hope given their circumstances.
Right.
So we go into the school, it's part of their curriculum. It's so great.
I love that. And I think that's a perfect way to round out our conversation, because that is all about what the other side of grief is, that you have to find ways to not only honor the person or the baby that you lost, but to be able to live your life knowing that you're doing the best you can and to make them proud.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure talking to you.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, it was my pleasure. And it was my honor to hear about Christopher and to hear about all the ways that you made his life incredible for even the small amount of time that he was here. And I'm so honored to share your story with other people.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me today on Pushing Through Loss. I hope this episode has provided support, understanding, and a sense of community. Remember, you are not alone on your journey, and you have the strength to face the challenges that come your way. If you found value in today's conversation, please leave me a review and consider sharing it with others who may benefit. Together, we can help each other heal and activate our inner strength warriors. Stay tuned for more empowering conversations, and until next time, you got this.